They say Vincent van Gogh was a madman, a failure, a lonely man with shaking hands and unsteady thoughts, a painter who couldn't sell his art, who couldn't hold love, who couldn't seem to live the way the world expected him to. That is the version of him history tells too quickly. But here is the truth. Van Gogh was not insane. He was not weak. He was not a man without purpose, or talent, or meaning. He was a man who felt too deeply in a world that encourages us to feel nothing at all. He saw colors in places most of us only see emptiness. He believed that every star was alive, that every field of wheat had a heartbeat, that even sadness had a shade of gold inside it. But the world did not have the eyes to see what he saw. Not yet. While he was alive, people laughed at his paintings, called them messy, uncontrolled, wrong. They didn't understand that those lines, that chaos, that trembling light were his way of saying, I am here. I am alive. I see beauty. Why can't you? He did not paint to impress the world. He painted to survive it. And yet, the world only learned to love him after he was gone. This is not a story about art. This is a story about what happens when a heart is ready to give, but the world is not ready to receive. This is the story of Vincent van Gogh, the man the world understood far too late. Before the world labeled Vincent van Gogh as a genius, a failure, or a madman, he was simply a person who felt more than he could ever express. He was someone whose emotions did not know how to stay quiet, whose heart never learned how to be small. From a young age, Vincent sensed the world in layers that others overlooked. A sky was never just blue. It was longing, distance, memory. A field was never just land. It was movement, breathing, a choir of silent voices calling to him. And when he looked at people, he did not see faces or names. He saw loneliness, the hidden kind, the type that sits just behind the eyes, the type no one ever admits to carrying. He once wrote, I want to touch people with my art. I want them to know what it feels like to be alive. This was not ambition. This was confession. He was not painting to be admired. He was painting because his heart would have shattered if it stayed silent. But feeling deeply in a world built on surface-level living is not a gift, it is weight. The more Vincent tried to share what he saw, the more others pulled away. They told him he was too intense, too emotional, too dramatic. They laughed at his work, dismissed his vision, misunderstood the very pieces of him that were most sincere. And so, slowly, he began to withdraw, not out of bitterness, but out of exhaustion. When your feelings are oceans and everyone else's waves, you learn to stay quiet just to stay afloat. Yet silence did not mean emptiness. Inside him, colors kept moving. The world kept speaking. He simply had to find a language that matched the size of his heart. And when words failed him, because words often do, he turned to paint. He poured entire universes into every brushstroke, creating not what the eye sees, but what the soul feels. His art was not decoration, it was survival. Before history made Van Gogh into an icon, before museums and auction houses and glossy reproductions, there was simply a man who wanted to be loved, not adored, not admired, just understood. And like many who feel deeply, Vincent did not love lightly. When he loved with the whole of himself, openly, earnestly, without strategy or guard. But the world, as it tends to, does not know what to do with a love that's sincere. He once fell in love with a woman named Gogh, his cousin by marriage. She had already lost her husband. She carried her own quiet grief. Perhaps Vincent saw in her a reflection of himself, a soul trying to stand again after being broken. He offered her warmth, presence, devotion, not in grand gestures, but in the small, steady ways that matter. Long conversations, shared silences, gentle concern. In his heart, it was simple. Two wounded souls could walk through life together. But to her, his love was too much, too intense, too unguarded, too close to the places she was not ready to look. When he confessed his feelings, she did not answer with softness. She simply said, "No, never." The word struck him not as rejection, but as erasure. It was the moment he realized that sometimes the thing you offer most honestly is the very thing the world is least prepared to receive. This was not his only love that went unanswered. Again and again, the tenderness he offered was met not with cruelty, but with incomprehension. People admired his heart from afar, but could not hold it up close. His love was not the kind that felt safe. It was the kind that required you to feel too, and most people are not ready for that. So he did what people with deep feelings often do. He turned the love inward and let it become art. He painted the ache of wanting to be seen. He painted the weight of wanting to belong. He painted what remains after the door closes. His canvases became all the things he never said out loud. The fracture didn't happen all at once. It came slowly, the way winter arrives not with a single storm, but with the temperature dropping, degree by degree, until one day you realize the world has gone cold. For Van Gogh, the coldness came from people. Not their cruelty, but their inability to understand. He would stand in front of a canvas, trying to paint the way the sky trembles just before nightfall, the way the wind carries memories across a field, the way pain glows faintly beneath the surface of a smile, and they would look at the finished work and say it was wrong, not beautiful, not real. They laughed at his brushstrokes, his colors, his lines that swirled and twisted like breath. They said it looked unstable, untrained, unrefined. They told him to paint things the way they are, without realizing that he was painting things the way they are, just not the way they saw them. This was the wound that never closed. The knowledge that he was not rejected for what he failed to express, but for what he expressed too honestly. He tried to belong. God, he tried. He joined artistic groups. He sought community. He tried to explain what he saw, to show that his art was not chaos but sincerity. But sincerity makes people uncomfortable. It demands that they feel something, and most people would rather stay asleep. So the world pushed him further and further to the edges, softly at first, then firmly, until he found himself living in rooms where silence echoed louder than voices. The loneliness did not come from being alone. It came from being unseen while trying to be seen. And when the mind has nowhere left outside to go, it begins to collapse inward. Thoughts loop, colors sharpen, emotions stop knocking and start breaking the door. He was not losing his mind. He was losing his place in the world. And the world never even noticed. There comes a point when a person stops fighting to be understood, not because they no longer care, but because the effort itself becomes too heavy to carry. For Van Gogh, that moment was not dramatic. There was no grand scene, no sudden break. It was a slow and quiet surrender, the kind that happens when hope has been stretched too thin over too many days. He had always lived at the edge of his own emotions, balancing between wonder and exhaustion. But now the exhaustion was winning. The colors that once burst from him with urgency began to feel like they required more than he had left to give. The world outside became louder, harsher. His own thoughts, once expansive and full of movement, began to twist inwards, echoing against the walls of his mind until even silence felt overwhelming. He admitted himself to the asylum at St. Remy, not out of madness, but out of a final attempt to stay alive. And it was there, in a room with a small window overlooking fields he could not walk freely among, that he painted The Starry Night. People look at that painting now and call it visionary, brilliant, otherworldly, but they often fail to see the simple truth inside it. It was the work of a man trying to remember that beauty still existed. The sky in that painting is not calm. It spirals, it trembles, it glows with an intensity that feels almost painful. And yet, within that movement, there is gentleness, a soft, unreachable peace. It is as if he was trying to paint a place he wished he could stay, a place where the world did not feel so sharp against the skin. He was not painting stars, he was painting distance. The distance between himself and the world he had tried so hard to love, and he knew that distance was growing. He could feel it. The world did not notice when Van Gogh died. It did not stop. No crowds gathered. No newspapers mourned him. His passing was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels less like silence and more like absence. He left behind a room of canvases, a handful of letters, and the echo of a man who had tried to give more love than he ever received. At his funeral, there were only a few people. The room was small, the air still, the grief private. His brother Theo stood there, holding the weight of a loss he had understood long before that day. Theo had been the one person who saw him, truly saw him not as a burden, not as a mistake, but as someone whose heart simply refused to shrink to fit the world. And now, the world had taken him anyway. It was only after he was gone that others began to look again, slowly, hesitantly, as if they were afraid to admit they had been wrong. Painters studied the movement of his brush. Critics reconsidered the emotion that pulsed beneath the color. People who had once dismissed him as unstable began to realize that he had been trying to teach them how to see not with the eyes, but with the soul. But this recognition did not arrive like a flood. It came like a light that flickers awake after years of darkness, growing brighter only because it finally has room to breathe. And by the time the world was ready to understand him, he was no longer here to feel it. Museums would one day fight to display his work. Auctions would one day speak his name like reverence. People would hang his paintings in their homes as reminders of beauty, of longing, of the soft ache of being alive. But appreciation means little when the hands that needed to be held are gone. Van Gogh didn't need admiration. He needed tenderness. He needed someone to say, simply, "I see you." And the world said it too late. There are some lives that are meant to be understood only in hindsight. Some hearts that were too large for the time they were given. Some voices that were whispers in their own lifetime and echoes in ours. Van Gogh tried to show us that beauty is not always gentle, and loneliness is not always empty. Maybe the world did learn to love him, just not while he was here. And maybe that is the quiet tragedy of being someone who feels so deeply. You arrive in the wrong century,